wait. My voice tends to drop. Thank you. I'm going to read some remarks. It was difficult for me to, I kept evolving what I wanted to say. Mm-hmm. And so I'm kind of going in three directions, and I hope you'll forgive that three directions-ness. The first thing I want to say is that I want to just preface my remarks by saying that the Buddha is often understood to be a physician. And like a physician, he's treating the problem of suffering. So the problem of suffering is central to Buddhism. How to respond to suffering is central to Buddhism. Okay, so I'm just going to read some remarks. My comments today are meant to contribute to a way of being here together, something that will help teach us how to nourish one another, to bring forth a living basis of our unique faith so that we can respond to the great need of the world. I speak from my experience as a Soto Zen priest and practitioner, teacher, and my experience as a professor of Buddhism, Buddhist ministry, and Buddhist chaplaincy at a Buddhist seminary. So our Buddhist seminary welcomes students from all Buddhist traditions and also from seminaries at the GTU. So we have an interfaith, every class in a sense is an interfaith class and an inter-tradition class. So it would be like if the Quakers, the Unitarians, the Catholics, the Lutherans, the Baptists, the Orthodox tradition all came together in one class to talk about another tradition or their own tradition. So it's
an experience.
It's great. It's wonderful. People ask the most amazing questions. So this is the context that I teach graduate students. I don't teach undergraduate students. We have relatively small classes. But I will say Buddhism, perhaps Zen to the most degree, has been appropriated, defined, and used to shore up individualistic agendas and sell all manner of things in secular society. So I did a little look on the internet. There are Zen baby carriages, software systems, ball bearings, Zen productivity workshops, spas, yoga, Pilates, dance, massage, e-commerce shopping carts, security surveillance equipment. We have Cloud Form Plus Zen recovery shoes, which I thought, are we supposed to recover? Huh?
And the riding of motorcycle.
Yeah. So we are sold 20 milligrams of Zen that offers a unique natural path to calm in pill form. In this context, a Zen master is a cloud-based set of virtual tools used to centralize and control workflow. Wow. In some English dictionaries, there are two definitions of Zen. One is a Japanese Buddhist tradition, and the other, in lowercase, is a descriptor of someone who is relaxed, unbothered by life and difficulty, and chill. So, in this world, the great richness and diversity and complexity of Buddhism is narrowed to mindfulness meditation, and it's also often understood that somehow mindfulness, Buddhism has a corner on the market of mindfulness, which is kind of ridiculous. Mindfulness becomes not seeing through the false notions of a separate self and transforming one's life according to the teachings of the Buddha, but a means of furthering one's ability to produce, to get ahead, to perpetuate the delusion of a separate self. So the tradition has been rated for techniques, plucked out of their context, and redefined in ways that make them virtually unrecognizable to anyone who is committed to the tradition. Granted that there is much that can be that much has been done, like mindfulness-based stress reduction, that's helped many people to reduce debilitating symptoms, and most Buddhists applaud those efforts. The problem is when those efforts become defined as Buddhism. So, For 2,500 years, Buddhists have been arguing with one another, debating one another, disparaging one another, just like any other religious tradition. In interfaith dialogues in what we generally call the West, the fundamental basis of Buddhist teachings has also been discounted, ignored, or misinterpreted. Talk to any person who's deeply committed to Buddhism, and you will hear stories of the tradition being dismissed, denied, or colonized by people of dominant faiths. It is not a religion, or it is a kind of religion in larval form that will do until a person finds another truth. It is nihilistic, amoral. It is only, at least in the West, inhabited by people who have been traumatized by previous religious traditions, so it's a way of turning away. At one meeting, I'll just tell you a brief story. At one meeting at the GTU, a respected Catholic priest instructed the venerable former bishop of Jodoshin Buddhism in the United States that the bishop's understanding of faith was incorrect, and that this Catholic priest had read the Dalai Lama, so he knew. As is his wont, the bishop said nothing. So I believe much of this is due to a lack of understanding of the teachings and also a deep-seated discomfort with a sacred tradition that is fundamentally different. It is not unusual for someone to get actively angry that there is no creator God in Buddhism. It seems odd to me, but there it is. So based on what they think they know, everyone new to the tradition approaches Buddhist teachings and practices with ideas about what it is. Everyone does this. So those of us committed to the Buddhist tradition teach practices to undo these limited notions, fixed ideas, and we, by entrusting ourselves to the Dharma, we understand that the Dharma will teach us. We can trust that our goofy ideas will be undone. So with regard to the questions we are addressing now, we say, what do we do? Do we, as a Buddhist, or as a Zen Buddhist, do I just let the marketers define my tradition? I think not. So I also find, however, that I'm less and less interested in the ways we describe things, people, ideologies, what we call truths, and more interested in how we encounter one another and our world in a particular time and place. How we listen, how we cultivate a stability of character and deep inner silence that allows encounter to be fruitful. So, is Alyssa here? Yeah, over here. The other day, when you described a talit,
yeah.
and wrapping yourself, I recall the
Prayer
words that we say when we put Buddha's robe on. This is a small version of Buddha's robe. As a priest, we use one that wraps around. So we say, great robe of liberation, field far beyond form and emptiness, wrapping ourselves in the Tathagata's teaching, Buddha's teachings, benefiting or saving all beings. So we meet at wrapping. We meet at the experience. What does it mean to wrap ourselves? So I'm not equating the theologies. Many Buddhists don't like the word theology because theos, right? But I use it because it's convenient. So I feel, I felt a kinship in the experience of wrapping, a kinship of putting a sacred robe on. The meaning of that, the theology behind that, we could have completely different views, but as human beings, to wrap oneself, to devote oneself, to listen, to be humble, that I think we can find our way with. So, as people of faith, I would say we reach down to the core of our faith and we risk encounter with a perceived other. I think silence and listening are the gifts of faith, mystery, not knowing, a willingness to be taught, to relinquish our agendas, our self-centeredness, without abandoning the particularity to which we have entrusted our entire being. So in Soto Zen, we talk about Kanno Doko, responsive communion with all of reality. So in this way, in our vulnerability in this fragile planet, our doubts, our questions, our struggles, our humanity are woven into a kind of encounter where we meet at the place of our humanity and our not knowing and our and yet our complete entrusting into a faith tradition. So I thought, how much time do I have?
We have until 5 to 11. Then we have to set up for the next thing.
Okay. So I thought what I'd do is just say a few words about Buddhist teachings, because they are different, and then talk a little bit about listening, if that's okay with you. For Soto Zen practitioner, how is the whole point. How is called our family name. So in each moment, in each activity, in each interaction, in each relationship, how do I express my bodhisattva vow? Bodhisattva, bodhi means awakening. Sattva is being. So a bodhisattva is someone who's dedicated their life not to their awakening, but to the awakening of all beings. It's salvation. Some of my Buddhist students don't like to hear the word salvation, but Buddhism is all about salvation. We say, I vow to save all beings. I vow to be awakened with all beings.
Could you repeat the term and maybe spell it?
Bodhisattva, B-O-D-H-I, Bodhi, awakening, Sattva, S-A-T-T-V-A, being. So we say, how do I harmonize body and mind with the community of other humans, of other living beings, of rocks and trees, of all aspects of life. And in so doing, realize and manifest the Buddha way. So this path is very concrete, very practical. Not because we're trying to get someplace, but because that's the whole of it in this moment. That's the whole of it. One does not reach liberation by following the path. The path itself in this moment is liberation. Devotion is liberation. So just a few comments about Mahayana teachings. So I don't want to go into the history, but Soto Zen is a Mahayana path, later iteration of the Buddhist teachings. The first teaching I want to talk about is the Teachings of Emptiness. This is, I think, the worst piece of translation that's ever made in the history of all religious traditions. Because emptiness sounds like nothing's there, right? It sounds like it's an empty cup, and it has these icky feelings of voidness and aridness. It's like existentialists define emptiness as like, this despair. You have to complete the phrase, empty of inherent existence. Okay? Empty of inherent existence. It means empty of separation, empty of isolation, empty of any permanent separation. So everything lacks what we call inherent existence. Permanence, separateness, isolation. This includes the self, and this is what's radical, right? We can talk about ecology, we can talk about lots of things, but when it gets down to where the rubber hits the road, I think, myself is empty of inherent existence. The flip side of these teachings is interdependence. People hear about Tiktahan, interbeing, that's a little easier for us to understand. The great teacher Nagarjuna says in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, when that comes into existence, this comes to be. On the arising of that, this arises. When that does not exist, this does not come to be. On the cessation of that, this ceases. Okay, you can study this for lifetimes. So we could spend all kinds of, we spend years studying these teachings. But what I want you to understand is that this is fundamental, and it's very different basis. Liberation in Buddhism of all kinds has to do with realizing the nature of reality, which is impermanent, it's interdependent, and it's empty of inherent existence. And when we grasp on to something when we see that which is impermanent as permanent, we suffer. The key is to allow the teachings to touch us, to be awakened to the nature of reality. Compassion, the heart opens. We are with all being. We are of all being. We are not separate. So there is no fixed permanent self. There is no soul. There is no creator God. The anguish that we experience, the suffering, the ways in which we feel out of whack, the traditional image is like a cart with a square axle or square wheel kind of lumping along. Discomfort, disease, suffering. The ways in which we cause harm to others arise according to Buddhist teachings because we do not see or realize this truth. We do not live the how of things. Because we do not, we habitually act in ways that are deluded and that increase our suffering and the suffering to others. This was the point that the Buddha wanted to address. So there were questions that people would come to Buddha, there's famous suttas about this, ask him all kinds of philosophical questions. And he basically said, don't worry your pretty little head about it. Pay attention to suffering. Pay attention to this. So realizing this how not only reveals the living dynamic reality to us, it is liberative. It is salvation. It changes us fundamentally, and it changes our relationship to all beings. So this, the second aspect I already spoke a little bit about, which is for Mahayana Buddhists, not for all Buddhists, but for Mahayana Buddhists, is this life of the Bodhisattva. So the Bodhisattva dedicates him or herself to a way of living out of a deep or partial or dim realization of interconnectedness and interdependence of all being, and therefore we have to understand that individual liberation is a contradiction in terms. To think that you are going to become liberated is just carrying the self forward. It's a manifestation of self-centeredness, which is fundamentally in opposition to the teachings. It is in and for community of all being that a life of practice is lived. There is no other way. And it is in realizing this life of vow within community that the joy of the Bodhisattva path comes forth. So I'm just going to mention briefly one third aspect that's specifically about Soto Zen, and that is that practice and realization are the same. That means one moment of enacting the Bodhisattva vow, one moment of aligning oneself with the teachings of interdependence is a moment of realization, whether you know it or not. So Dogen Zenji says, when Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they don't necessarily notice that they're Buddhas. They don't necessarily cognize that. But they are actualized Buddhas. So it is in the action that things occur. It is in the enactment that things occur. So this means that practice is not a means of carrying or delivering the self to a new state, presumably one that's going to be nice and comfy. It is the transformation of the center of one's life, from this one to all being. So the center of one's life is vow. The center of one's life is all being, not this protective one. The self is understood to be an integral part of interdependent reality, not the center of it, and practice is the enactment of that interdependence. In other words, realization is not your property. It is not now, nor will it ever be yours to own, define, or possess. It is enacted in each moment with all being. and it is all being, not the human self, that is the active center of spiritual practice. Shohaku Okumura says, the subject of this practice is not this person. The subject of this practice is not this person. So, Dogen says in Yuibutsu, Yobutsu, only a Buddha with a Buddha, observe the activities of Buddha for a while. Buddha's activities take place when the entire earth and all sentient beings, with the entire earth and all sentient beings. If they are not with all existence, they are not yet the activities of a Buddha. So that means awakened practice is this incredible intimacy, this responsive communion with all aspects of reality. Everything is included. Dogen stands, he's talking to the cook here, and in the Soto Zen monastery, cook is a very senior position. To be the head of the kitchen is equal to being head of the meditation hall. So he says, handle even a single leaf of green in such a way that it manifests the body of the Buddha. This in turn is the Buddha's awakening. This in turn allows the Buddha to manifest through the leaf. This is the power which you cannot grasp with your rational mind, which doesn't mean you don't use your rational mind. It operates freely according to the situation in a most natural way. So these are some of the key points that underlie how we meet one another. What is this responsive communion according to Soto Zen teachings? Dogen says that monks should be like milk and water. You know, when you pour milk and water together, there's no difference. And he also says monastic life, which means community life, which means the life of the whole planet, is like crossing the ocean on a single ship. And that monk should be harmonious, like the mixture of milk and water. It is this, when he says this is not just an injunction meant to lead to placid relationships and everybody being nice. It doesn't mean that this is how you get someplace else. It is the description of realization. It is the description of the activity of Buddha. This is responsive communion. So this is the transformative process that happens in Soto Zen practice, and it is the undergirds what happens when we meet across traditions. It means it's the basis of respecting the particularity of the other, meeting the other with intimacy, with deep listening. It is the opposite of colonizing the other. That is, Dogen Zenji says, to carry the self forward is delusion. That myriad things come forth is awakening. So to live with myriad things come forth with their own truth, their own manifestation, their own Buddha nature. We won't get into that, but that is awakening. So there's no defining of the other. The truth is living in that place where you're deeply listening with a sense of not knowing, but not wobbliness. Of course we all wobble, but where you're in your place, you have your own particularity, and you're listening and being with the particularity of others. So this is the sense of realization of harmony, not like, oh, kumbaya, but harmony that has dissonance in it, that has difference. When we chant in a Soto Zen monastery, we say chant with your ears, but not so that you can all make it really sweet. You chant with your own voice, and somehow when you chant with your own voice, it works, right? It just, something happens. So this is this listening practice. Dogen Zenji says, we vow together with all beings from this life on throughout numerous lives to hear the true Dharma. That we are always listening. So I sent you all something about listening, and I thought I'd just cover a few more. You doing okay with time? You can stop me anytime and say, wait. So what I wrote about listening was for a Japanese English language interfaith journal. And it caused me to think about what the roots of listening are. And in the Lotus Sutra, the Sutra of the Lotus Flower, the Wonderful Dharma, they talk about a Bodhisattva gives multiple gifts, material gifts, the gifts of the Dharma. But one of the gifts that the Bodhisattva gives is the gift of fearlessness. Listening requires courage and requires confidence, and it gives the gift of fearlessness to ourselves and others. The gift of fearlessness is to not turn away, to stay present for what is happening in all its complexity, contradictions, discomfort. Rav Shabtai asked me to bring the sutras here. And I said, I'm uncomfortable with that, but I'm willing to be uncomfortable. I thought, I'm uncomfortable. Yeah, I could feel myself, I don't know what people are going to say about our sacred texts. And I thought, but that's the point, isn't it? Yeah. So we give fearlessness. We give fearlessness, we grant intimacy. And intimacy teaches us that we are part of this interdependent dynamic whole. We are not isolated. We come to know and trust and have confidence in that intimacy, in that interdependent reality. This is Kito Sensei of the Soto Zen-nan calls this Fudo heart. Fudo is, it's really fierce. Fudo is a manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, which is the Bodhisattva of compassion. Really fierce. And Fudo has a rope. And whenever you try and get away from the Dharma, Fudo ropes you and brings you back. So he or she is a manifestation of stability. So Fudo heart is fierce and fiery commitment to an unshakable capacity to stay present. So this is the accepting heart. So we ask ourselves, how do we support Fudo heart? And I say first, as a Buddhist, we listen to the Buddhist teachings that return us to our true nature, as we say. We listen to our own hearts and minds, and that way we develop confidence. We release the need for an immutable position on which to hang our hopes and self-esteem, or the need to defend one view. And with this confidence, there is a flowering of a kind of creative curiosity, which I don't know about you, but I have felt in this room these last days. We give dignity to ourselves and others. Dogen Zenji calls this the dignified activity of a Buddha. And our willingness to truly listen. We allow ourselves to be touched, to be changed, to be transformed. We see the places where we might be rigid. We don't rank others. We practice generosity and kindness. And we, Kenon Bodhisattva, the Bodhisattva of compassion, said to be she who hears the cries of the world. That's where we land. We become intertwined with one another. You know, when I leave here, when we all leave here, we will have been changed by our encounter. Yeah? And to welcome that change requires courage, I think. So we listen deeply, and we develop the skill of listening. We develop the ability to rest in ambiguity, unease. When our world doesn't match the worlds of another, what do? Sometimes we desire to erase the differences, pretend they don't exist. It's much easier, isn't it? Try to eliminate the differences. say, oh, it must be like this. You must be like this. Oh, I get it. Yeah. Oh, I see. Yeah, Bodhisattva is the same. Oh, it must be like that. It's not like that. So what do we do when it's not like that? How do we actually stay close together and respect one another? So to listen across differences, we call on Fudo's heart, the ability to stay settled, undeterred by apparent obstacles to compassion. We return to the core virtues of honesty, generosity, fearlessness, kindness. For me, I return to the teachings of the interrelated nature of all existence, equality and particularity, and this posture of granting dignity to the other and to ourselves. This confidence, I think, is key. With a genuine and deep confidence, we don't need to convince the other of the rightness of our way, nor do we have to dismiss the beauty that another tradition can present to us. This is what I call an ethic of diversity. It thrives in what seems like a paradox. We fully and completely commit ourselves to our tradition and appreciate that others will do the same in theirs. In fact, it's the commitment of each member in a dialogue to their own tradition that is the primary point of contact and communality, communication. So, I hear, I wrap myself. I do not presume to know what that means to you, but I have a sense of what it means for me to wrap myself each morning. So this points to a way of being with others in which the focus on beliefs, I think, is maybe not so central. It does not erase difference, but it doesn't allow difference to foment discord. So we eat together, we share together, we work together, we allow the differences to exist, and we find our human contact, I think. So in my version of this is we call ourselves to hear, and we call ourselves and are called to hear the true Dharma as it is expressed each moment by all being in their particularity. And I believe in this way we bring healing. Yeah. Just questions, comments? Yeah. Okay, where do we?
He's going to direct.
Axel? Huh? You?
Oh, me first?
Yeah, you
Oh,
first.
I can't speak for Judaism or for many other necessarily traditions like you know yours, but I'm just so struck with the present moment and the communal aspect because at least in the Orthodox understanding, salvation is not just an end time event. It's happening in every moment of liturgical time. And furthermore, we are not saved alone. Okay, we are, it's a communal thing. And I guess I'm just so struck with that being just actually the core of Christianity as I understand it.
Well,
So,
yeah, great.
I have some real naive question. If I try to process what you said, and I would like to tie it with, we heard yesterday from Shalansky, for example, or thinking about the Nazi regime and what would the Buddhist do when he's encountered, he's arrested, he's taken in.
Yeah.
If I could process what you said, I think it will say that the evil is functional evil and not essential evil. This is what I mean. That the evil is because it does evil, it disrupts the world, and it's not inherently evil. Is it true?
Yeah, I don't think there's inherent evil. There is delusion, profound delusion. So I really like the way the Tibetans talk about anger, for example. If you believe, if if you are operating on the principle that it's okay to harm another being, you're profoundly deluded. So the duty of the Bodhisattva is to cultivate compassion for the other being who's so trapped and act effectively to stop it. So you don't say, oh, I'm so sorry that you want to go kill these people. My heart breaks. No. You say, whoa, you are really deluded, dude, and I'm going to do whatever I can do to stop you from harming others. Not just because of the person who's being harmed, but because of you.
Because of you. So I have to help you by preventing you from doing
Exactly.
It's functional evil.
Exactly. Yeah.
I like you brought up exactly what I was thinking of, the Bodhisattvas and the saints comparison.
Uh-huh.
So when I was in school, when I learned Buddhism, obviously Church of England school, they said that, in Buddhism the Bodhisattvas are like archangels. And I think that many of us, when we hear the descriptions of Bodhisattvas, it's very easy to make the jump.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this is archangels, or this is the revered saints. Could you speak a little bit more about the difference, especially in light of impermanence?
Yeah.
Just so that we're all operating on the same kind of...
Yeah. Well, I think, somebody asked me once, what was the hardest thing for me to learn about Buddhism? And I said, unequivocally, time. Time is fundamentally different in when you have a beginning and an end to when you have Okay. So eternity is not about eternal long time. It's a time, a linear time. So the Bodhisattva, to say the Bodhisattva is there's kind of many meanings to Bodhisattva. One is the kind of embodiment of certain virtues. Like the Avalokiteshvara, Kannon Bodhisattva is a Bodhisattva of compassion. Manjushri is a Bodhisattva of wisdom. Samantabhadra is a Bodhisattva of shining practice. There's all of these kind of archetypal events that we identify with. It's very different from what I understand about the saints who are intercessory. Prayer exists in Buddhism. We pray, Kannon Bodhisattva, please hear my cries, And I'm no expert on the saints, so I forgive me if I get it wrong. But the Bodhisattva is a person dedicated to awakening. The Bodhisattva is also, in a kind of more transcendent realm, so to speak, the embodiment of certain characteristics. But they don't have an intercessory, because there's no creator God, there's no intercessory realm. So I would say, in my limited understanding, that would be the key difference. Yeah.
Go for it. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
Just a short question.
It was just a quick clarification. But yeah, go for it. Yeah. So just a clarification. So when one prays to the Bodhisattvas, is the view that the Bodhisattva is going to respond to the prayer with grace? Or
Grace, you're bringing up all of these tricky things. Because there is no creator God, there is no grace in that sense. And there are so many paradoxes in Buddhism, as I think there are in any religious tradition. So the posture of prayer is the posture of humility. Is the posture of, I am a human being. I am a part of this whole, and I am in that posture of humility, calling on the. Like one time, I was giving a teach. I don't know if any of you have heard of Pema Chodron. She's a very famous Buddhist teacher, and I was giving a talk in her monastery, and I got there, and she said she was scheduled to talk, and she said, "I don't feel like talking tonight. You talk." I was terrified because not only was I a new teacher, but they were expecting Pema Chodron. Right? So I saw these Tibetan Buddhist teachers on the wall, and I was like, help me. I don't know who you are, but help me. So there's this sense of it's that kind of thing. So I think the thing that's so important is that to emphasize the interdependent and impermanent nature of reality. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Okay. Hi, thank you very much. Thank you for that kind of connection. I'm glad that that it was significant for you, the thing that I did with Talit and everything. So you were speaking about how, from a Buddhist perspective, from a Zen Buddhist Soto perspective, that certain things are very different from Judeo-Christian perspectives, and one is dealing with number of time, another is dealing with a deity who are you praying to, and such. And that reminds me of a cartoon that I saw once. Not a cartoon, it was the title of an Onion article. You know, Onion's the satirical newspaper, and it said, Buddhist leader threatens to unleash a wave of compassion on the West. The West. And I thought it was hilarious. And just like a very different kind of outlook and response to the world. And I wanted to ask, in relation to this conference, dealing with faith and with multiple truths or different styles of truths that we find in academia and how we relate to that, what are the problems or the kind of difficulties that, let's say, Buddhist students would have in an academic setting? What is it? Is there something that really doesn't line up with your practice or you say faith, your commitment, and how do you deal with that?
That's a great question. I think in our seminary it's very interesting because we have different Buddhists with very different views of Buddhism. And I say I count it as a success when every single one of my students says, that's not Buddhism.
Yeah.
So that's great because they're seeing the diversity and the difference, and then they have to examine what is the basis of my understanding? How can I be with that? When they go into, and our students have to take classes at other GTU schools. So sometimes they'll go into a classroom in which Buddhism is basically discounted. Even at the GTU this happens. Not in this class. But. And that's very, very difficult. It's very difficult for students because the truth that they're dedicating their lives to is not recognized, or it's colonized, or it's defined for them, as this one we speak to Bishop Yamoka. On the other hand, I really want people to take classes in which the person speaking is a person of that faith.
Right.
I want them to be confronted with difficulty. Because for one thing, we're a minority faith, so we better be able to operate in that world. And that, I think, is a good difference. That it cultivates this sense of diversity. Does that answer your question?
But not just in the sense of when somebody discounts Buddhism, but in academia in general, or like going to university. If there's something that somehow doesn't line up with your faith commitments or your commitments as Buddhist, because I know from like a Judeo-Christian perspective, there are certain issues with the idea of relative truth and that there isn't really a truth you can know, or issues maybe with certain scientific principles or things like that might come up. So I just want to know if there's from your perspective.
Well, you have to take into account the range of diversity of Buddhism. Right. I mean, you've got
from your community. From
my community, I haven't seen any problems at all. That's just what I see.
Yeah.
I don't know why that is exactly. Maybe it's because knowledge and belief has a certain role that's maybe a little different.
Yeah.
That we have this whole thing about relative and absolute truth, which I will not get into. But I haven't noticed any difficulties.
Okay. So we have chapter, we have Daniel, and we have Irina. And we have
I found something that for me is a very Jewish concept. That can I rephrase what you said in some way that actually every activity that you have, if you're in the right system or network, everything is prayer. You pray the entire time.
Yeah.
Because you listen the entire time, you pray the entire time, and the prayer is not to get something, not because you want to get something, because the prayer itself is the achievement.
The
actual.
You achieve
prayer
the
is the
achievement.
achievement.
Prayer is the
Exactly.
achievement.
Exactly.
Right? So,
And the sacredness of each moment, each thing.
I think this is something which is very relevant to people. Actually, you can consider every activity as prayer.
Yeah.
Every knowledge that you acquire, every person that you meet, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Daniel?
I don't want to take too much time away from other questions. Very briefly, I was so struck by what you said about interfaith dialogue being mediated by specific experiences rather than tenets or kind of broader principles. But I think at the same time, I find that I'm struggling specifically with that because the way that you've described Buddhism seems to me to be extremely, in very general, broad terms. And my experience of Judaism is as extremely specific, both in terms of historical events and texts, and maybe most of all, laws and practices. So just in terms of leaving aside all tenets of faith and all kind of general principles, as a cognitive mode of religion, I find, at least the way you describe Buddhism, to be very different than my Judaism. And I'm wondering if there's a way that you could describe it that would be more specific, either in terms of actions or texts that would enable me to kind of bridge that cognitive divide.
I'm not sure I understand your question, but the 2,500 years of suttas and sutras, of sacred writings, of expressions of awakening that have specific teachings. I mean, I'm trying to give you a real, I mean, imagine going into a group of people and saying, I'm going to tell you what my tradition is about in 15 minutes. What do you do?
That's what I'm asking.
What do you do? You know, you grab a few things that you think are distinctive about the tradition, and you bring them out. What I'm trying to say is that I think a lot of times where we get lost in interfaith dialogue is that we feel like we need to have equivalencies. And in order to begin the dialogue, we have to dig down into the theology and find points of contact. And that's good. That's good. I mean, I learn a lot by studying Judaism. I co-taught for quite a while with a fellow who'd been a Benedictine monk, and I learn a lot. But I think if we focus on points of contact, of what it means to live a devoted life, what it means, then we have bridges that we can go. Which it doesn't say that we don't do the cognitive bit too.
So we have 10 more minutes and 3 questions. So I ask you to brief and to ask briefly and to answer briefly.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do my best.
Elina, it's your
Thank you so very much. Very briefly to state a presupposition. As a therapist, I find it tremendously enriching to listen to your understanding about suffering and dealing with people, because a lot of therapists embrace in the here and now moment, which is essential, and the same thing that Buddhists embrace, not that that's part of Buddhism per se from that understanding. So that is a pivotal point that we connect to that. But I have a very difficult and a very precise question that is a heartfelt question that a Christian would have, and that is, what is the, and forgive me, but what is the lack of Buddhism before a person becomes so?
What is what?
Lacking being a Buddhist. Is there a consequence before that? For example, in Christianity, there would be.
I'm sorry, what was it?
In Christianity, a person would have a consequence of not being a Christian,
Oh,
is there such a thing? Not that, as you were saying later on, you can't necessarily try to get away from it, not that you would want to, but before a person becomes a Buddhist.
is there a
an
consequence to not being a Buddhist?
Mhm.
Well, is there an understanding, and forgive me, I don't
No,
know
no,
much
please.
about it, but is there a consequence when a person isn't a Buddhist yet and to become one? So, at what point does a person choose to become a Buddhist? That,
Talk about the idea of conversion.
I guess
When
so,
when
yes.
Is there a border to be crossed?
Yes,
And,
yes.
Thank you.
If you believe that Jesus Christ is a risen Lord, you cannot believe that there is no Creator God.
Well, yes.
You can't. I'm sorry, this doesn't work that way. So that's why I just think it's so important for us to value what our faith is and say it. And say, no, it's like I went through CPE with a friend of mine who was a rabbi. And you know, we were the two non-Christians in the group, and we bonded in a certain way. And she was like, we have God. And I'm like, yeah, you go. You have a God, that's great, you know. So there is a whole question about karma and about awakening, and there's a whole lot that could be said.
And
But
you might have touched upon it, but the words sometimes are a little bit different for us to understand.
yeah, yeah,
No, thank you.
yeah.
Because I know Western music fairly well, if I listen to Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata, first of all, I have to listen in silence. I got to get out of my head.
Yeah.
But because I understand that, I can listen through it and understand where it's going. But if I listen to a piece of 12-tone music, or if I listen to something from the Japanese tradition, I really have to listen in a kind of radical silence. Because if I bring to bear any of the musical understanding I have, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And the more I'm open to listening in silence, the more I can expose myself to something that is expressing something deeply, but in a way that is incommensurable in some ways with the various forms in which I can make sense out of Beethoven. And I gather what you're suggesting is at the core of dialogue, is listening in silence, and as much as we cherish and need the words and the dogmas which enframe what we believe, there's a sense in which the words fundamentally get in the way of things. They delimit and unclear. So at the basis of the dialogue is this ability to really listen to one another in a deep silence, which in some sense suggested we've already listened in silence to our own tradition. Is there?
Well, you know, I had a whole thing written about silence, so that I didn't want to get into. My name actually is Daijaku is silence, and the silence is the radical silence that you're speaking of. But as one of my Zen teachers says, silence is probably the best way to express the Buddha Dharma, but you have to say something. So we say something, and that's we meet in that.
You're very brief.
Uh-huh.
So I was so happy you talked about emptiness.
Uh-huh.
And in the patristic tradition, there's a parallel. Are you familiar with that?
You know, to my great regret, I am not so
Okay,
familiar
no,
with
just
with
that's all.
Orthodox theology. Yeah.
So, because I would have liked to heard a little bit more about the concept and the idea of emptiness
Uh-huh.
of a person.
Yeah.
So that's it.
Yeah, it's a huge topic. which
Because I
we
know
will
we're under
continue
time.
At the GTU,
Yeah, I know. We'll work on it together.
So I have a question of Abhiram, and you will answer to Nikita's question. If we have some more moments left, then okay. So
Well, I think this question of this is why I say it is such a terrible translation, because our minds, most people who encounter it, go towards nothing, and there's a lot written about the emptiness of emptiness, which is we talk about empty of inherent existence, we think of absence, or because we think in terms of is and is not, we say, well, something either is or it is not, and those categories do not apply. So we say, this is why we talk about thusness. So to say that, it's like somebody said, nothing is not something called nothing. and it's also not nothing. Right, so to live into that is, what happens to our brains kind of go, meh. So but the emptiness is empty of inherent existence, empty of separation, empty of permanence, empty of, yeah. Does that?
I'm amazed by the whole concept because I love it.
Yeah, so do I. Because it's liberative.
Yeah.
It's like Anne Klein, who's this wonderful Buddhist scholar, said, the Mahayana Buddhists don't just teach emptiness because it's true, we believe it's true, we teach it because it changes us in positive ways.
I think George Maloney, are you familiar with Maloney? He was a Jesuit, would be in awe of this.
So we have some moments left for your question.
Yeah.
I think I'm following up on this question. You said 2 days ago that you ask questions, but you're not seeking for answers because you're not limiting yourself for answers.
Yeah.
I was wondering, you serve in the academia, and the entire purpose of the academia is giving answers.
Yeah.
So how does your tradition deal with that?
Provisionally. So an answer is an answer, and it's good to have answers, but answers are not the answer. I'm getting very zen here. Right? If we settle, Dogen Zenji says, you can only see as far as your eye of practice can reach. That means the answers that you come up with are going to be answers within the world as you know it. And the world as you know it is determined by your own partial view. So it's fine to have answers, but you must not attach to those answers and go to battle over those answers. You must see them simply as answers that can be, we know this, right? It's like if you study a sacred text, right? You study it, 5 years later you come back to it, you see something different. 5 years later you come back to it, you see something different, you see something different. And hopefully that keeps going until you die. You don't say, oh, I studied that portion of the Torah, I know what it's about, I've got the answer. No, I don't think so, right? So it's in that spirit. Okay?
Good non-answer.
Thank you. We made it on time.
Okay, everybody, we're setting up for 5 minutes now. We have time to and then we're going to start the joint session, and Alison Bowden is going to join us via Zoom.
What about? Oh, okay. Good.
And we're going to do. We're switching it up.
Okay. Switching it up.
When were you planning to share that information? Yeah, really. Wait, I haven't even done the PowerPoint
I was going to say something at the beginning. This is the plan, and let's see how it goes.
You're right.
Yeah. Just in case
this year. No, I think this is. I mean, what we do is
what we had talked about, isn't it?
Can I tell you something?
you know, if she wants to do an example about
concept, right?
Probably.
So in that case, the best way for them to build dialogue. I understand the Christian.
When you use music as a metaphor, it is so helpful. Because your point, as I understood it, I put myself right in that moment.
Should I turn it off or should I record them?
I think you should put it.
I have presuppositions. I have frameworks that I've developed over time. Some are unique to me, and some are ones that I've learned to me. Those can get in the way of my understanding of something else, which necessitates radical silence of the mind to bring something else on board, which is probably a continual process. I just love it.
The philosopher in me circles around
Don't forget about this. We want to talk about it.
Although, I don't claim to be an expert in philosophy, but I do think it's a really helpful
Taking advantage of like 2 minutes.
Resting space for interfaith dialogue. I think it's very helpful. And in many ways, I think it's necessary. For common understanding, defines your philosophy.
although there's a great intervention. I never could understand it. I never could listen to it and not get rid of all of it.
Right. Well, Wittgenstein thought philosophers were...
Well, apparently he was very deeply religious. He was very attached to
But it seems like it's
faith-based religion, but I think he was very well, I think we can all read the food off anyhow.
I'm always curious to know how philosophers view him. So often critical of
much less
entire
art and things like that. A lot of women have ways. And I also have one. Just like you have a guy around Europe or something, or I do have one. The partial one you said, you know, like all the qualities. This is like really great. I have that with
I wore those for 10 years.
Yeah.
And then suddenly when my hairline was okay, I've lost.
We'll never do that.
You know what I mean? And I saw it as loss and shame. Okay, this is so cool.
That's right. For a lot of women.
Doing away with
Good morning, Pecan Ward. I'm good. How are you? Thank you. How was your night?
Fantastic.
Perfect. Good. I have a question for your cab on Friday morning. When do you want?
6
a.m. We can have a 3 a.m. before Shabbat. The taxi driver goes driving Shabbat. The Children Tel Aviv around 12.
Why? I don't want it. Tell me why.
I'm thinking that
9:30.
Very at the bottom of it. You don't ask, what is God? You say, what did God do? You don't say, what is the natural world? You say, do this, don't do that, and then you build from there.
No, now you're muted.
It's almost like it's
Now you're showing.
Thank you so much. She's a concise and like
Scary.
It's almost like
Well, I told my mother about your
especially started by that.
I told her. I said to her that I want It seems like
Part of religion being embodied in a form as an action.
Yeah.
It's very
Well, see, like a lot of people say it's not.
This is just
There's no form.
There's no, but obviously there are.
I think that's what it
talk to
is.
see
You do
concept like questions. What is it?
I was in there. Thank you.
There's an Orthodox theologian from
אבל אתה רואה את עצמך שם. אתה שם לב שאתה רק עצמך שם. יש דרך שהכרה לי גם כן.
And so they're concepts, and it's unavoidable. But we're talking about an ultimate that simply can't be described, whether it's an ultimate manifest God or if it's Dharma. Dharma is your ultimate story. Okay, you can't wrap words around it, but you have to, at some point you have to stop talking.
And, but then you come back and you go to the and start talking.
Right, but we can only, it's an approach avoidance. You can only get so close. And then you have to stop. Then you can go back and talk some more. Right. But at some point,
How they argue, how they
you just can't describe that reality adequately.
I mean, I see that they have, that there's a...
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Great.
Live real life.
Oh, about what?
So we worked out